You know, I told them, I said, I may not be able to understand all of the words that it is that you guys are speaking in Spanish, but I can feel the same Spirit. And that same Spirit that moves even here every Sunday was the same Spirit that was moving on a Friday evening there on Wade Hampton. And it is just so exciting to know that God doesn't care about any He doesn't care about any political spectrum. He doesn't care about any particular race. He doesn't care about, you know, whatever it is that you may think about yourself. He says, listen, if somebody's hungry, I'm going to show up. If somebody wants me, I'm going to be there. If somebody really wants to touch me, they can touch me. And that is the God that we serve. While you continue to turn to Revelation 2:18, I do want to say yesterday in studying, it was last night really, it was a little before midnight. It was a pretty exciting evening, pretty exciting thing that began to unfold and take place. I was there, as I usually am. So most of the time, Aiden's there next to me. Last night he was tired. I told him to stay inside. Some car pulls up, a car I didn't recognize. We live in a court, and pulled up to our neighbor's house, 2 houses over. The mailbox they have there, the thing kind of broke, and the door was swinging. The little flap thing that you open to pull your mail in, it was swinging. This car pulls up, halfway on the driveway, halfway off. He opens up his car, shuts off his lights, grabs the mail, throws it in the car, and then he begins to take off up the road with his lights off. I said, well, this sure seems pretty fishy. So I'm there trying to study and, getting things done. And my wife is inside saying, man, my husband's so amazing. He's probably right now interceding on behalf of our family. But here I found myself in pursuit of this vehicle. And I called up 911 and was following him all the way through Whitehall. And I finally got to a point where I said, listen, the rest is up to y'all. I'm not gonna risk my life for some stolen mail. So I said, here's where he's headed. This is the license plate. This is the description of the vehicle. And then I turned back around and began to head home. And as I was pulling back into my court, I seen a sheriff deputy pulling out. We both kind of passed each other, backed up, met up. And they began to ask me, were they still heading down Whitehall? I said, yes, they were. They pulled off a bunch of side roads. I continued to follow them. And then they continued to go down Whitehall. He said, well, the plates that you gave us actually belong to a stolen vehicle that we are searching for. So, again, a little bit of excitement that took place, about midnight last night. So that was pretty fun. But God is good. I called up Sarah. I said, babe, just so you know, I did take a break in studying. But I have continued. And so I did get right back in. And I'm excited about today's lesson. So let's go to get right into Revelation 2:18. It says, and unto the angel of the church in Thyatira write, these things saith the Son of God, who hath his eyes like unto a flame of fire, and his feet are like fine brass. Verse 19, I know thy works and charity, and service, and faith, and thy patience, and thy works, and the last to be more than the first. Verse 20, notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants, to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. Verse 21, and I gave her space to repent of her fornication, and she repented not. Verse 22, behold, I will cast her into a bed, and them that commit adultery with her into great tribulation, except they repent of their deeds. 23, and I will kill her children with death, and all the churches shall know that I am he which searcheth the reins and hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works. But unto you I say, and unto the rest in Thyatira, as many as have not this doctrine, and which have not known the depths of Satan as they speak, I will put upon you none other burden. Verse 25, but that which ye have already, hold fast till I come. And he that overcometh and keepeth my works unto the end, to him will I give power over the nations. And he shall rule them with a rod of iron, as the vessel of a potter shall they be broken to shivers, even as I received of my Father. Verse 28, and I will give him the morning star. And lastly, verse 29, as he ends every other letter, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. Amen. With that said, I will be continuing this study that we began a few weeks ago. This one being on the church of Thyatira. And you guys may be seated in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So a little bit of the background on this particular church. This church was the fourth church from that island called Patmos, where John the Revelator was given vision, and he was given this revelation. And Jesus has appeared unto him saying, I've got these letters that I want to be delivered. If you look at any of these letters, they are all in red, which means they were all spoken by Jesus himself. So John indeed writes down the letters to these churches, to these cities, and they begin to make their way. So they start off with the first one of Ephesus, they continue on in Smyrna, then Pergamum, which we did last week, and now here we are in Thyatira. Thyatira was 35 miles southeast of Pergamus, so kind of as it begins to go up, it then begins to start curving and making its way back down until it comes up to the last church in the last city of Laodicea. So at this point it's now starting to come back down. Thyatira, 35 miles southeast. This mic is getting on my nerves. I don't know if any of you guys can hear any popping or just going in and out. But if it continues, we'll switch it. If not, then it'll be great. But this particular church was indeed the least noteworthy of all 7 churches. If you remember any of the previous churches and cities that we've gotten into, they were big. They were glorious. They were full of coliseums. They had big theaters that could fit 10,000 people. You could hear a whisper from the front. They had huge temples. They were known as innovators, as inventors. They had schools of science. All of these amazing things. And this church was kind of really the church and the city in particular was the opposite. Again, it was the least noteworthy. It was surrounded by rivers, and you would think that would make it beautiful. But these rivers were actually full of leeches, so people didn't even go in there, play in them, and it wasn't an enjoyable place. It wasn't by any means a vacation destination, and it was also a very small city. One thing that it did have going for it, though, is that it was on a major road of the Roman Empire, and there were many trade unions, they called them guilds, that were formed here. And if you worked here, and these unions would all kind of settle into the city, it was kind of like their base, that if you worked within this city, you would be a part of one of the guilds. You would be a part of one of these unions. There were carpenters and tent makers and potters and weavers and robe makers and dyers. And in fact, Chris, if you could put up Acts 16:14. So, I said that there was dyers and all these things that they did, their tent makers and all of these things that they were involved in. And when you go to Acts 16:14, you actually find the first reference of this particular city. It says, "And a certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple," again, she was a dyer, "of the city of Thyatira, which worshipped God, heard us, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul." This, many believe, was one of the first converts within that city of Thyatira. And again, referring to Lydia herself being a dyer, being one that was making of purple. Prophetically, as you can see by how many verses were in there, every other church that we've gone into, every other city that we've gone into has been short. I mean, there was one, 2 of them ago, I think it was Smyrna, was only like 3, 4, 5 maybe verses max. This one is like 10 and 12. I mean, you've seen how long I was reading. Half of my time is gone just reading this letter. But it also covered, as I mentioned, that typically these cities and these churches also reference a portion of time. This one covered the longest span of time, approximately 1,000 years, going from the 6th century up through the 16th century. So it would also make sense that it's got the longest portion of study and scripture in here as well. This particular time, though, from the 6th century to the 16th century, historically speaking, it's called many different things. We see it called the Dark Ages. We see it called the Medieval Ages. This was a dark period in history, a dark period in time, historically speaking. This was a time when the bishop became pope and he gained full power. So it wasn't just a Roman bishop, it wasn't just a Catholic bishop, but now the pope was supreme. In fact, he was above all of the other emperors, he was above all of the other kings. This pope was really, in their mind, they were God. They weren't just sent from God or representative of God, they were the final say. And if you wanted something done, you better come and prove it to him and get the okay of him first. Otherwise, if not, you would literally have hell to pay. One particular point, there was a German emperor, and the Pope, in order to demonstrate the level of power that he had, he made this German emperor stand outside barefoot in the snow for several hours before then allowing him to come in and kiss his ring and then proceed. But the Pope was one that did want to prove that he did have all power and the final say. So verse 18, very first passage of study, it is the first and the only reference in all of the letters where Jesus refers to himself in the title as Son of God. He continues also talking about eyes like blazing fire. one of the things that one of the reasons why he's using this particular term, eyes of blazing fire, is that he had the ability to pierce any disguise. He had the ability to pierce any facade. In other words, you may be able to fool others, but you can't fool me. I've got the eyes of burning fire. I can see into the depths of your soul. You can't fool me or pull anything over me. And so he is making reference of that, and then he continues on with his description, saying feet like burnished bronze. And one of the reasons why he used that reference is that he was the only one that can also trample on sin. So not only was he able to see into the innermost part of every person there, but also had the ability to trample on sin. Now both of these descriptions were needed because this particular city and church were the most wicked of every other one that we have covered so far, and really, more than likely as well, going forward, will cover. So it is no accident that he describes himself in this way, as it is definitely needed. In verse 19, kind of similar to what he does with all of the other letters, he talks about the good qualities that this particular church has. In verse 19, he continues on, he says, I know thy works and charity. So he's listing the good things that are in them, and service, and faith, and thy patience, and thy works, and the last be more than the first. In other words, they had a servant attitude. They had a servant mentality. They understood that the last were the first were the last. They had this part down. But then he continues on, and for 3 verses, 20 through 22, one of the things that I have not mentioned yet is their religion, the big religion that was common back then. They had a temple where they worshipped Apollo. Apollo was kind of the second in command guy. There was Zeus that we talked about last week over there in Pergamum, where there was the big altar. There was the throne of Zeus. There was the altar of Zeus, all of these things. But next in line was Apollo. And Apollo was the, you could say, kind of the second god, and the next one that was in charge. And it was this particular, Apollo, the sun god, and emperor worship. So the temple was made. One was for Apollo, the other was for the emperor worship. And in order for the emperor to communicate what he wanted communicated, he had a prophetess that would sit in the temple on a tripod and she would end up entranced and speak messages. And that was the messages that was given from their quote-unquote God. One of the things that is fascinating is that God, when He's talking to people, He will always refer to the character of the person, and He will always give it a name. In this particular passage, we see one of the names being mentioned as Jezebel in verse 20. Jezebel was, if you remember the story, she married a man named Ahab. She had 800 prophets of Baal. She began to stir up idolatry. She began to stir up pagan gods within Israel. Her husband Ahab being king. Jezebel had a dad who was king of Sidon, which is a little bit above Israel. Wicked also. Jezebel, though, was very, very wicked. I mean, here was the children of Israel that loved God. They served one God. And Jezebel would try to introduce the idea and that it was okay to conform. It was okay to worship other gods, in this particular case, Baal. And the Bible tells us that she had 800 prophets of Baal that would sit at her table. She would feed them. She would take care of their needs. Anything they needed, anything they wanted, they were taken care of. If you remember, there was also the prophet Elijah. He goes and he says, how about we see which God sends fire down from heaven? And it was God, the God of Israel, that begins to send fire down from heaven. All of the people see that these prophets of Baal have no God, no power, no ability. So they then go and then they kill all of those prophets. Jezebel is super angry. She's bitter. She's mad because her whole mission as queen has been to convince the children of Israel to worship other gods other than the one true living God. So, as I mentioned, she was a daughter of a king of Sidon as well. She was very wicked. She was ruthless. She was a seducer of the people. Now, in Thyatira, in order to work, you had to be a part of one of those guilds, like I told you, one of those unions. It didn't matter your occupation. If you wanted to work here, you had to be a part of one of these unions. And you had to kind of do what it is they did. And it didn't matter. If you were a Christian or not, you had to be a part of it, and you had to go along to get along. And so part of their traditions, part of their customs that they would do is they would meet frequently and they were devoted to lascivious acts that were connected with worship of erotic idols. They would hold meetings that were held occasionally in pagan temples. They would eat the foods that were offered to the idols. The church's position was not to engage, not to do this, on paper, and maybe even perhaps behind the pulpit it was preached, well, we really can't do that. But the fact of the matter is that there was a Jezebel, there was a spirit of Jezebel that says, listen, we've got to do what we've got to do. I've got to provide for my family, so if I've got to do this and join this union, this guild, and I've got to, take part in this, I'm going to do it. Don't worry, I'm still a believer. But there was that compromised spirit that seeped into the church of Thyatira. Verse 23 is very fascinating, but before I even get into that, but you can put up verse 23, I found it somewhat like, wow, because go ahead and put up 23. It says this, and I will kill her children with death. So it's not only talking about Jezebel, but it even says, I will kill her children. And I was like, man, that is kind of harsh. But as you begin to study the story, the history, the background of this lady Jezebel, I told you she was very wicked and all that she brought into Israel. But it wasn't enough, because just below Israel was another nation, another country called Judah. Now Judah, she wanted, because they still worshiped God, and she didn't like that there was still a place even that close that wasn't worshiping Baal, that didn't have idols to Baal, that didn't have prophets to Baal. So she set something up where she had her daughter marry the king over there. His name was Jehoram. Now Jehoram was within the line of David, and so she sets up her daughter Athaliah. It's spelled Athaliah, it could be pronounced Athaliah. But she has Athaliah, her daughter, marry this king of Judah, and to begin to do exactly what she did in Israel, but now in Judah. Athaliah, you're going to get them to start worshiping Baal. You're going to start convincing the children of Judah that it's okay, that it's permissible. So she did exactly that. Athaliah was very good at the task that she was given. In fact, she had her husband, the king, his 6 younger brothers, all killed. She wants to make sure that nobody was going to try to take the place. So she wants to set that up. It's me and it's the king, and we're going to hold together. We're going to wipe out your line so that nobody can ever challenge us on that side. And so it was set up. He ends up dying. His son takes over. His name was Ahaziah. Ahaziah was now next in line. He was only 22 years old, but his mom, Athaliah, was like, I can still control him. This is still fine. It's still good. So she had no problem with him. You're going to be king. You're going to be a good king. Let's go and do it. We're going to rule together. Around this time, there was a man that was prophesied that he was to be king, and that part of his job was to wipe out the household of Ahab. His name was Jehu. Jehu was a bad dude. Like, this was a fighter. This guy was a guy that didn't play around. He goes to Jezebel's house. He calls Jezebel. Jezebel was like, listen, I've been able to seduce every man that I've ever come across. I'm going to do the same thing with this prophet. The Bible tells us she put paint on her face. She put all kinds of makeup on. She did her hair up real nice. She was getting ready to go and seduce this prophet Jehu. But Jehu was not falling for it. In fact, Jehu looks up at the house where Jezebel was and says, is there anybody that is with us? Is there anybody with the house of the Lord? There were 3 eunuchs that said, we are. He said, then push her out the window. They push Jezebel out. She gets trampled. She's dead. There's nothing that's found of her other than her skull, her palms, and maybe, I think, her feet as well. Jehu went into her house, went and ate some food. It was nothing for him. He said, cool, now we need to continue on our mission. So let's go, and we're going to get now her son, Ahab's son, which was another guy who was now king after Ahab passed on. And so they began to go after this guy. He was out fighting war. He got hurt. He was in this city called Jezreel trying to recover. This again was Jezebel's son, the new king. And Jehu says, no, we're going to continue on with our mission. We're to wipe out the household of Ahab, so let's go. So they begin to make their way. They now find this guy in Jezreel, Jezebel's son, and he says, cool, I'm going to kill him. But he didn't know that Ahaziah, if you remember, this was Athaliah, the Jezebel's daughter in Judah, her son, was also in Jezreel visiting his uncle. So he's over here in Jezreel visiting his uncle, which is about to get killed by Jehu, but he has no idea. So Jehu shows up. I told you, he was a bad dude. He's got his bow and arrow. He's ready to go to battle. And, this king, he goes out there, Jehoram, and he's like, hey, listen, go ahead. I need you, he tells the outlook guy, the guy that's the lookout, and he says, I want you to go ahead and send one of the messengers and ask Jehu if he comes in peace. So he sends a guy to go ask him if he comes in peace. Jehu says, listen, what do you have to do with peace? Join my side. I'm going to be king. The guy says, okay. So he comes back. So the king now is talking to the lookout. He says, hey, did the messenger come back? He says, no, I see him out there, but he's not coming back. So he sends another one out there. You know, this messenger goes, delivers, have you come in peace? What do you know about peace? Come join me. This messenger now joins him as well. So finally, this king that was wounded, he goes out there on his chariot, and he now realizes that Jehu was coming to kill him. So he starts trying to turn around and take off. And as he takes off in his chariot, Jehu pulls out his bow and arrow and poof, right between the shoulders, and the arrow goes right through the back of his heart and kills him. He dies right there. The interesting thing about that, as a side note, is that his death took place, which was Ahab's son, in the very vineyard that belonged to a man named Naboth, who, if you remember, Ahab and Jezebel had this man killed to take his vineyard, and sure enough, it was then his son, their son, that ends up getting killed in this same vineyard. You talk about justice being served. Listen, you don't worry about vengeance. You know, when God says, I will take care of you, I will take care of my people, just know that you may see it, you may not, but justice absolutely will be served. So this king, then dies. He gets shot with that arrow. Hazael is still there. Now remember, this is the king of Judah. He gets scared. He starts to take off running. They get him. They kill him. So now there's Athaliah, who is still in Judah. If you remember, she was the mom of the king, so she was cool with that. But she gets word that her son was just killed. So she does what any woman that wants to keep power, that was very possessive, that was just absolutely wicked would do in her case. She arranges for the guards and all of them to begin to wipe out all of the family line that belonged to her kid. So all of her grandchildren, she literally had all of her grandchildren murdered because she didn't want any of them to be able to assume the throne. She was going to step in. So every one of them were killed except for one little one-year-old infant. He was only one at the time. His name was Joash, the high priest, and this little boy's aunt, which was the wife of the high priest, went in, they protected him, they fed him, they clothed him. Athaliah was queen over these people, again, very, very wicked. In fact, they say that she even took parts of the temple of God and would use it to build altars unto Baal. Very, very wicked. And she ruled for 6 years. And during these 6 years, this little boy was still hidden. And they were feeding him, they were teaching him, they were training him in the law of God. And they just began to just talk to him. And sure enough, when this little boy was 7, the high priest, Jehoiada, brings him out and then declares to everybody that this is actually truly the next king. This is the one that should be next in line, as it follows tradition back then. The son of the king would then take rule. At 7 years old, he goes out in front of the temple of God. He's holding the law of the Lord, and he's got a crown above his brow, right there on the top of his head. The queen gets word. She hears a commotion. They're celebrating. Goes on. She looks out the window. She begins to shout out, treason, treason, treason. The high priest orders her killed. Boom. And Joash, now this little 7-year-old boy, assumes the throne. For 40 years, it actually says that he did which was pleasing in the eyes of the Lord. While the high priest was alive, this boy for 40 years reigned and brought them back to believing and serving the God of Israel. So when it talks about in verse 23, it says, will kill her children with death. This is what it's talking about. They understood this back then, 2,000 years ago. They knew the story of Jezebel. They knew the story of her child, Athaliah. They knew the story of all of this taking place. So again, as I go through these, I want to break it down to give you somewhat of an understanding of what they knew back then and believed. So we continue on. Verses 24 through 27, God is telling them to be strong. He's telling them to hold fast till I come, which is same as even now. It may look dark, it may look wicked, it may look tough. Things may be getting hard. It doesn't seem easy. I mean, truly, there are Christians all over the place that are being held to even a higher standard, being accused of discrimination, being accused of all of these different names. And yet the message then is the message even now, to hold fast till I come. In verse 28, go ahead and put up verse 28 real fast. I'm going to have you flip to another one. Verse 28, though, says this. It says, and I will give him the morning star. That was one of the things that kind of intrigued me, because in 1 Peter or even somewhere else in Revelation, in fact, go ahead and put up Revelation 22:16, Chris. He's talking about to those who overcome, to the one that gets past, to the one that is faithful unto death, to him will be given the morning star. In Revelation 22:16, it tells us what that star is. I, Jesus, have sent mine angel to testify unto you these things in the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David, and the bright and morning star. So you may feel as though you've got nothing to carry, you've got nothing of value, you've got no treasure. But he says, listen, if you are faithful even to death, you will be given the morning star. You will be rewarded with me, with eternal life, with joy unspeakable, with peace that surpasses all understanding. There will be no tears, there will be no crying, there will be no sorrow, no heartache, no pain. Somebody clap your hands to the Lord right now. Amen. Amen, amen, amen. And then in verse 29, as it begins to wrap up, again, the same thing, the way he's ended all of these other letters, previous three, and then this one to all these churches. He says this, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. Again, I told you, kind of one of the things that spurred this study again was the fact that somebody had said to me, well, those letters don't apply to anybody nowadays. Those were only for them back then. And yet, if it was true, if it was only for those particular cities or only for those only churches, Jesus would not end it with to everyone that has an ear. Right. He wouldn't end it with that and then saying, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He would say to the church of Thyatira, to those that can hear in Thyatira, make sure you hear what the Spirit says to Thyatira. But instead to what the Spirit says unto the churches. There is lessons to be learned from each of them. In Ephesus, the theme was, don't let your love for Jesus grow cold. In Smyrna, it was, do not fear the persecution of the world. In Pergamos, it was, trust the word of God to keep you strong. And in Thyatira, it was, do not conform to this world, but stand strong. Yes. Amen. As I think back over this period of time of history, what it represented, and again, it was a very dark time, the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. But there was something on the horizon that history now tells us that they had no idea back then. But there was a man named Martin Luther getting ready to step on the scene. And there was a Reformation that was getting ready to take place. And man, we are going to get into the next church next week. But again, it is also exciting, fun. It is just amazing, the things that you can get from these. But we serve a good God, amen? Yeah. Amen. We serve an amazing, good God, a God that is on time and faithful and just and just truly, truly amazing and incredible. We've got, if the musicians can begin to make their way up here, we do have several announcements. And we've got,